Welcome back to PLS 510 Forage Management and Utilization. Today we will be talking about Timothy, scientific name Phleum pratense. Timothy may go by the common name herds grass, but it's quite common for most people to call it just Timothy. It is a perennial bunch grass, although you'd have to list it under the short-lived type of perennials. It's very erect. It's a tall growing species. It's used almost exclusively for hay in a monoculture and occasionally in mixes with red clover or alfalfa. Since it typically is a horse directed crop, then putting it with alfalfa would be the more common than probably mixing with red clover. It is not used very much in pasture because it is again an erect grass that does not have much regrowth after the first cutting, so it's not very useful to a pasture producer who's searching for a long season grazing crop. It's very well adapted to the northern regions of the United States, survival limited further south, and of course we're at the edge of its southern range of adaptation. Picture of Timothy on the right shows this very prominent cylindrical seed heads and its erect bunch and tall growing nature. If you're called on to identify Timothy, let's hope that it's in seed head stage when you're called to do it, because that cylindrical inflorescence or seed head is very characteristic of Timothy. And there's only one other grass that we might commonly, or I should say uncommonly see, but we would see it in Kentucky, that would have a seed head that's similar, and that is reed canary grass. If you are doing a pasture evaluation and you're looking down at the vegetative portion of the plant, then you're going to be looking at how the leaves come out of the bud. In this case, they are rolled. In other words, they have a round tiller base. Their ligule is prominent and membranous and not very tough, so very sensitive, probably would be torn when you would see it. Certainly in a hay sample it would be disrupted. And the auricles, which are those portions of the leaf that wrap around the stem or the next leaf that's emerging, those are called auricles. Timothy does not have any auricles. The other identifying characteristic that is unique to Timothy among our major cool season grasses is a structure known as a haplocorm. The haplocorm, or sometimes just corm for short, C-O-R-M, is a carbohydrate structure at the very base of the stem. This is a line drawing of Timothy that may be helpful in getting a picture of some of these structures in your mind. We'll start at the left, and the inflorescence of Timothy, that long cylindrical seed head, that's very characteristic. Those seed heads could be as short as 2 inches and as long as 6. If you look over to the right and at that drawing of that area where the leaf sheath joins the leaf blade, and that's called the leaf, that zone is called the leaf collar. Of course, this is the ligule, and it's membranous and quite large, but also very flimsy, if you want to think of it that way. And there are no auricles, and if there were some, they would come off of the leaf right where the leaf joins the sheath. And the haplocorms, this shows the diagram of where you would find it on the plant. The next slide will show you a lot better what it looks like. On the left, you'll see a clump of plants, and at the very lower right edge or corner of the photograph, you can see what looks like a kind of a swollen round structure, mostly green or light green in color, some brown, and that's the corm or haplocorm. Over to the left, you'll see a plant with a much less prominent corm, and so you may have to look at 2 or 3 tillers to find it. The picture on the right is after you've stripped away all the outside green material, and you can see how it's corm is right there as the stem is coming out of the crown area of the plant. And the corm is a carbohydrate storage structure that gets called on to fuel regrowth after cutting. And remember I said that timothy doesn't have a lot of regrowth after cutting, but it will have some, depending on the year and how old or young the stand is. But it also would be a structure that gets called on to keep the plant supplied with carbohydrate over the winter. We said just a minute or two before that timothy is very well adapted to the northern regions of the United States, and those would be colder and again the humid regions. We're in actually the very southern edge of the area of adaptation of timothy. Timothy is grown in the northwest, and these would be irrigated circumstances almost exclusively, and these hay crops are quite valuable because they're quite high yielding and they're able to harvest them with very little rain. So timothy is one of the most winter hardy forage species we can raise, commonly grown in Canada and Sweden. It just is not going to be very tough. It has very poor tolerance to high temperatures and dry conditions, and it has a very shallow root system. More than 80% of its roots are in the top 5 centimeters, which happens to be 2 inches deep. Fared a poor tolerance to flooding and poorly drained soils, and even though we've given it a value of intermediate in terms of its soil fertility need, if you're going to raise timothy, then you're going to need to be supplying quite a bit of nutrients to be cost effective. It is comparable probably in terms of yield in response to fertilizer, as orchard grass. Now there is a forage quality paradox with timothy, good and bad things at the same time. The bad is when it's mature, it is very low quality. The good is when it's mature and late cut, the headed timothy is recognizable and desired by horse hay buyers. So late cut timothy is very low in protein and digestible energy. So from a nutritional standpoint, it would probably not be your first choice of feed for younger growing animals like the ruminants. But it could be a cow source of hay, or a source of hay for cows, if you knew and had the test to show you that you had the energy needed and the protein needed for the class of livestock you're going to feed. Late cut timothy can be good, especially for horses that have something we call a metabolic syndrome. It's similar to insulin sensitivity in humans, and it makes them have some very negative reactions to high quality forage, and the low quality of mature timothy hay will mean that the horses are going to be kept quite busy chewing and eating, which is good, but they won't necessarily get a large influx of carbohydrates or water-soluble carbohydrates at any one given time. When horses with metabolic syndrome are fed a lot of feed with a lot of water-soluble carbohydrates in them, then they can develop problems like diabetes, and also it can lead to laminitis. Selecting varieties in Kentucky is actually an easier thing than almost any other state, because we have probably the largest variety testing program in the country here, centered in Lexington. We certainly plant and harvest timothy varieties under a hay management regime. We also have timothy in some of our grazing tolerance and grazing preference trials for horses. But timothy varieties, or timothy as a species, matures later than other cool season grasses, and that can be used to your advantage. There is a fairly wide range in heading dates between varieties, and whether and which variety you choose will need to be decided on based on what else you're going to be growing with it if you're not growing them as a monoculture. Alfalfa and red clover and other cool season grasses, for example. If you want the maturity of the Timothy to match up more closely with that of alfalfa, then an early maturing Timothy variety would be desired. Here is an excerpt from a table in one of our variety trials. This one happens to be a little older. This is the 2012 trial in Lexington, Kentucky. And there's several points I'd like to point out. First of all, let's talk about the table itself. You've got the varieties, the maturity, the seedling vigor, the percent stand, and the yield. Those are the columns. Then the variety choice along the left. Two varieties are highlighted, Derby at the top and Barpenta at the bottom. If you look at their yield, Derby had almost, well, actually more than a ton difference in yield and this is annual yield than Barpenta. But look at the stage of maturity when on the date of harvest. Derby was half headed out while Barpenta was still elongating a stem. In other words, the head had not come out yet. So we'd call Derby an early maturing variety and Barpenta a very late maturing variety, and this will impact its placement or its how it shows up in yield trials. And it's a point that we'll make when we get to variety testing and interpreting yield trials again. But when you're dealing with grasses, in particular grasses that have a very wide range in maturity dates at the first cutting, you need to check and see if the variety tables do give you that information, and then take the yield information that's given and presented with a grain of salt. Barpenta may in fact be the best variety you might pick because it is going to mature later when you can make hay. Derby may be great if you're growing it with alfalfa and be high yielding, and they'll match up closely together on maturity. But if you want for it to maintain some quality later in the spring, then it would be less desirable than Barpenta. Let's talk a little bit about the agronomic management, and I want you to form a context or a framework in your mind about relative numbers of things, like the relative number of amount of seeds pounds per acre needed to seed. All of our small seeded forage crops are going to need to be seeded at about 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep. But I'd like you to have a feel and actually remember pretty closely how many seeds per pound there are in certain of our key species. If you look up in AGR 18, our forage and grain crop seeding guide, you'll find that Timothy has over 1.1 million seeds per pound. If you do a 6 pound seeding rate, that winds up being, well, 6.6 million seeds per acre. And if you divide 6.6 million by 43,560 feet in an acre, square feet in an acre, that winds up being about 150 seeds per square foot. If you price out Timothy, you can find it typically between $1 and $2 a pound, even for the best of varieties. So if you were going to think and keep in relative cost in your mind, Timothy at 6 to 8 pounds per acre at $1 to $2 per pound, then your cost of seeding per acre could range as low as $6 up to $16. Contrast that with tall fescue, which has about 250,000 seeds per pound. A typical seeding rate would be about 20 pounds per acre, and a cost for tall fescue may be as low as $2 a pound, or maybe a little less, but it can easily go up to $4 a pound or close to it for the novel varieties. So if you want to do a per acre cost of seeding a novel endophyte tall fescue at 20 pounds of seed per acre and $4 per pound, that makes the cost per acre $80 in seed for novel endophyte tall fescue, compared to 6 to 16 for Timothy. Again, we'll make a statement about fertility. The fertility needs of Timothy are similar to orchard grass. It has we use the language moderate tolerance to low pH and low phosphorus soils, but you would have to say that it would not yield very well. It may live, but it doesn't yield well. It is compatible with legumes in the sense that it has a more open side than other bunch grasses, with low amounts of regrowth after the first cutting. So that's desirable because if you grow it with a legume like red clover or alfalfa, the most common two, then these are going to have some pretty heavy cuttings or high yielding cuttings after that May harvest. And then you can get a cutting of grass and legume hay in the first cutting with Timothy or one of these legumes, and then your subsequent cuttings will be mostly legume, which may be more marketable depending on your situation. If we want to think of it about in the management of Timothy for hay and grazing, and again mostly is produced for hay, Timothy is going to produce a high quality hay if it's harvested in the late boot to early reproductive stage. And when you use the word, or when we use the phrase high quality hay in this course and at any other time, in your mind you have to know which kind of animal you're speaking of, because a high quality hay will differ in definition between a horse and a cow, and even between cows and growing animals like heifers or steers, and even among cows that are differing in levels of production. Remember that 70 to 80% of the seasonal yield from Timothy comes in the first cutting, and that it provides very little regrowth, so as a pasture crop it's not very useful. So grazing is possible, but few fields really are pastured, in spite of the fact that Timothy is a frequent component of lesser expensive pasture mixes. If you had your choice, you would have to say that the Timothy is not adding much to that pasture mix. Frequent defoliation of Timothy is going to weaken the stand because it has a shallow root system and because it stores little carbohydrate within its reserves, that corn. So as we draw this to a close and summarize, Timothy definitely has some advantages. It is high yielding. It's recognized by horse hay buyers. The harvesting window in the springtime is better. It's later during weather that's warmer typically and more conducive to good curing. It typically establishes quickly. It can be high quality if it's cut at an earlier stage than full heading. And the low quality of fully headed out Timothy hay can actually be beneficial for mature horses with low nutritional needs. And as we worked out in our little exercise, it can be relatively low cost to seed per acre. Disadvantages to Timothy definitely would include its short stand life, its susceptibility to high temperatures and dry conditions, the low amount of regrowth, the low nutritional value when it's harvested mature, and the fact that it's easily weakened by grazing and also by frequent defoliations, and an open sod. And if you think back, we said open sod could be beneficial to allow legumes to grow, but open sods can also allow for weed encroachment too, and that would be the usage that you would see, or the reason why you'd see open sod as a disadvantage for Timothy in this table. So that brings us to the close of the short lecture on Timothy. Until next time, see you then.